You can sleep in the basement tonight, Mom. The heating's broken up here anyway. The words hit me like ice water, spoken so casually by my own daughter as she adjusted the thermostat in her beautiful living room. I stood there holding my overnight bag, watching steam rise from her coffee mug while goosebumps formed on my arms. The basement she was referring to was an unfinished concrete cave beneath her house, where the old furnace rumbled and pipes dripped condensation onto cardboard boxes. It was November in Michigan, and the temperatures had already dipped below freezing. But what froze me to my core wasn't the cold air seeping through her windows. It was the realization that my daughter, the child I had raised alone after her father abandoned us, genuinely believed I deserved to sleep in conditions she wouldn't subject a stray dog to. That night, shivering on a musty air mattress between paint cans and Christmas decorations, I made a decision that would change everything. By morning, I had already called the utility company. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Before that moment, before the basement and the broken heating and the casual cruelty, my life revolved around Sarah like a planet orbits the sun. She was my universe, my pride, my reason for getting up every morning for the past 38 years. I was 19 when I had her, barely out of high school myself, with a boyfriend who disappeared the moment I told him about the pregnancy. My parents had wanted me to give her up for adoption, said I was too young, too poor, too unprepared. But the moment they placed that tiny, wrinkled baby in my arms, I knew I would move mountains to give her everything I never had. And I did. God help me, I did. I worked 3 jobs during Sarah's early years. Mornings at the diner on 5th Street, slinging coffee and eggs to truckers and early shift workers. Afternoons cleaning houses for wealthy families in the suburbs, scrubbing their toilets and washing their children's clothes while my own child waited at my neighbor's apartment. Evenings at the grocery store, stocking shelves and running registers until midnight, my feet screaming in worn-out shoes that I couldn't afford to replace. Every dollar I earned went toward rent, food, and Sarah's needs. I wore the same 3 outfits for 2 years, rotating them like a uniform, while Sarah had new clothes every season. When Sarah was 7, I decided to go back to school. Not because I had time or energy, but because I wanted to show her that education mattered, that we could rise above our circumstances. I enrolled in night classes at the community college, studying by the light of a desk lamp after Sarah fell asleep. My textbooks spread across our tiny kitchen table like battle plans. It took me 6 years to get my associate degree in accounting, attending classes between shifts, taking exams with fingers still smelling of bleach from cleaning houses. The day I graduated, Sarah sat in the front row wearing a dress I had sewn, myself, clapping louder than anyone else in that auditorium. That degree changed our lives. I landed a job at a small accounting firm downtown, with regular hours and benefits and enough income to move us out of the cramped apartment we had shared for so long. I found us a little house on Maple Street, nothing fancy, but it had 2 bedrooms and a yard where Sarah could play. I remember the day we moved in, watching her run through the empty rooms with her arms spread wide, claiming the bedroom with the window that faced the morning sun. I stood in that living room surrounded by boxes and felt something I had never experienced before. Hope. Sarah excelled in school, just as I knew she would. She was brilliant, curious, always asking questions that made me scramble to find answers. When she struggled with math in 4th grade, I hired a tutor, even though it meant eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner most nights. When she wanted to play violin, I drove to 3 different pawn shops until I found an instrument we could afford, then sat through every lesson, every practice session, every squeaky, off-key recital with a smile on my face. When she discovered her love for science in middle school, I worked overtime for months to buy her a microscope for her birthday, watching her face light up as she examined leaves and insects and drops of pond water with the intensity of a real researcher. High school brought new challenges and new expenses. Sarah needed a car to get to her after-school job and her college prep classes. I traded in my reliable old sedan for a beat-up truck and gave her the better vehicle, reasoning that her future was more important than my comfort. When she wanted to go on the senior trip to Washington, D.C., I picked up extra shifts for 2 months, my body aching from the additional hours, but my heart full when I handed her the envelope with enough money for the trip and spending cash. College applications meant more expenses, testing fees, application fees, campus visits that required time off work I couldn't afford to take. But I took it anyway, driving Sarah to universities across 3 states, staying in cheap motels and eating gas station food while she toured campuses that looked like palaces to my eyes. When the acceptance letters started arriving, I cried. Over each one, proud beyond words that this brilliant young woman was mine, that all our sacrifices had led to this moment. Sarah chose State University, 3 hours away, with a full academic scholarship that covered tuition, but not living expenses. I took out loans to cover her dorm costs, meal plans, textbooks, and all the little things college students need. When she called home crying during her first semester, overwhelmed by the workload and homesick, I drove up that same weekend with her favorite cookies and a care package full of comfort items, sleeping in my truck in the campus parking lot because I couldn't afford a hotel room. She found her stride eventually, majoring in business with a minor in psychology, making friends and joining clubs and growing into the confident young woman I always knew she could become. I attended every graduation ceremony, from kindergarten through college, sitting in those auditoriums with my camera and my pride, documenting every milestone of her journey. When she walked across that stage to receive her bachelor's degree, I stood up and cheered so loudly that other families turned to look at me, but I didn't care. That diploma represented 22 years of sacrifice, of choosing her dreams over my own comfort, of believing that love could overcome any obstacle. After college, Sarah landed a job at a marketing firm in the city, a good position with room for growth. She rented a small apartment downtown, and I helped her move in, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs and helping her arrange furniture we had bought together at discount stores. She seemed happy, fulfilled, building the life we had both worked so hard to achieve. I thought we had made it, that all the struggle had been worth it, that now we could enjoy the relationship I had always dreamed of having with my adult daughter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For a while, things were good between us. Sarah would call every few days, updating me on her work and her social life, asking for advice about everything from cooking to dating to navigating office politics. I treasured those conversations, feeling useful and needed and connected to the woman my little girl had become. We had dinner together once a week, sometimes at her apartment, sometimes at my house, talking and laughing like friends rather than just mother and daughter. When Sarah met Marcus during her 2nd year at the firm, she was glowing with happiness. He was older, established, already successful in his own right as a real estate developer. I liked him immediately. He was polite and charming, and more importantly, he made Sarah laugh in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child. When they got engaged after a year of dating, I cried tears of joy, thinking about the wedding we would plan together, the grandchildren who might follow, the family, gatherings that would fill my house with noise and love. The wedding was beautiful, held at an elegant venue that Marcus paid for, with flowers and music, and all the touches that made Sarah feel like a princess for a day. I wore a dress I had saved for months to buy, sitting in the front row with tears streaming down my face as I watched my daughter promise to love and honor the man of her dreams. During the mother-daughter dance, she whispered in my ear, "Thank you for everything, Mom. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Those words felt like validation for every sacrifice I had ever made. After the honeymoon, Sarah and Marcus bought a house in the suburbs, a beautiful colonial with 4 bedrooms and a 2-car garage, the kind of home I had always dreamed of providing for her but never could. I was so proud, so happy that she had achieved the stability and comfort that had eluded us for so many years. When they invited me for dinner to see their new place, I brought flowers and a bottle of wine, eager to celebrate this new chapter in their lives. The house was everything Sarah had ever wanted: hardwood floors, granite countertops, a master suite with a walk-in closet bigger than my first apartment. Marcus had done well for himself, and he was generous with his success, making sure Sarah had everything she desired. I walked through those beautiful rooms feeling grateful that my daughter would never know the kind of financial stress that had defined my own life, that her children would grow up with advantages I could never have provided. But somewhere in those perfectly appointed rooms, something began to shift. It was subtle at first, so gradual that I almost didn't notice it happening. Sarah seemed different, more distant, less interested in our weekly dinners and daily phone calls. When I mentioned feeling lonely in my empty house now that she was married, she suggested I find some hobbies, maybe join a book club or take up gardening. When I asked if I could visit more often, she said they were busy settling into married life and needed space to figure things out. I tried to understand. Newlyweds needed time together, needed to establish their own rhythms and traditions. I didn't want to be the clingy mother who couldn't let go, who couldn't accept that her daughter had grown up and moved on. So I pulled back, giving them the space Sarah said they needed, filling my days with work and television and the occasional lunch with old friends who were also learning to navigate the strange territory of adult children who no longer needed their mothers in the same way. But the distance grew wider instead of narrowing. Phone calls became less frequent, lasting minutes instead of hours. Dinner invitations dwindled to once a month, then once every few months. When I suggested we plan a vacation together, just the two of us like we used to do, Sarah said she and Marcus were saving for a cruise they wanted to take for their first anniversary. When I offered to help with the cost, she said they didn't need my money, that Marcus could afford to take care of them both. That stung more than I expected it to. For so many years, I had been Sarah's primary source of support, financial and emotional. Suddenly, I felt unnecessary, like a piece of furniture that had served its purpose and was now taking up space in someone else's life. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that this was what success looked like, what I had worked so hard to achieve. My daughter didn't need me anymore because I had done my job too well. The shift from being needed to being tolerated happened so gradually that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. Like watching your hair turn gray in the mirror. You don't notice it day by day, but suddenly you look up and wonder when everything changed. Sarah's new life with Marcus had polish and sophistication that my modest existence couldn't match, and I began to feel like a reminder of a past she preferred to forget. It started with small things. When I called to share news about my promotion at work, a modest raise after 15 years of loyal service, Sarah's response was lukewarm. "That's nice, Mom," she said, distracted by something happening in the background. I could hear Marcus calling her name, asking about dinner plans with his colleagues. The conversation ended abruptly with promises to catch up soon that never materialized. I hung up the phone feeling deflated, realizing that my biggest professional achievement in years had been reduced to background noise in her busy life. The invitations to their house became more formal, less frequent. Instead of casual, come over for dinner calls, I received text messages with specific time windows. Sunday at 6 p.m., dinner will be ready at 6:30 sharp. When I arrived with homemade dessert, the apple pie that had been Sarah's favorite since childhood, she barely acknowledged it, setting it aside with a polite thanks before serving store-bought cheesecake to her guests. I sat at their dining room table, surrounded by Marcus's business associates and their wives, feeling like an intruder in my own daughter's life. The conversations at these gatherings revolved around vacation destinations I couldn't afford, restaurants I'd never heard of, and investment strategies that might as well have been spoken in a foreign language. When I tried to contribute a story about something interesting that happened at work, Sarah would interrupt with a gentle but firm redirect. "Mom, let me tell you about the promotion Marcus just got." The message was clear. My experiences weren't quite sophisticated enough for this crowd. Marcus, to his credit, was never directly unkind to me. He was polite, even charming. But there was an undercurrent of condescension in his interactions that made me feel small. When I mentioned having trouble with my old car, he suggested I shop around for something more reliable, as if I hadn't already spent months researching every used car lot in the county, trying to find something I could afford. When I complimented their new furniture, he launched into a detailed explanation of the designer they'd hired and the importance of investing in quality pieces, seemingly oblivious to the fact that my own living room was furnished with items from garage sales and clearance racks. Sarah began adopting Marcus's attitudes, his way of speaking, his casual dismissal of anything that didn't meet their elevated standards. When I wore my best dress to their anniversary party, a dress I had splurged on specifically for the occasion, Sarah greeted me with a once-over that made me acutely aware of every flaw. "Oh, Mom, you look nice," she said, the pause before nice speaking volumes. I spent the entire evening feeling like I was wearing a costume, playing a role I wasn't quite qualified for. The critical moment came during what I thought would be a pleasant weekend visit. Sarah had called me on a Thursday, sounding stressed and overwhelmed. "Mom, could you come stay with us this weekend? Marcus is traveling for work, and I just feel so anxious being alone in this big house." Of course I said yes. My daughter needed me, and despite all the growing distance between us, that still meant everything. I packed my overnight bag carefully, including a bottle of her favorite wine and ingredients to make her comfort food, grilled cheese and tomato soup, the meal that had soothed every childhood illness and disappointment. I imagined us curled up on her expensive sofa, talking like we used to, reconnecting over shared memories and mother-daughter honesty. Maybe this would be the weekend that bridged the gap that had been widening between us. When I arrived Friday evening, Sarah was on a conference call, gesturing for me to come in while she paced around the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear. I waited patiently, unpacking groceries and starting dinner, listening to her discuss marketing strategies with colleagues who seemed to call at all hours. The call stretched on for over an hour, and by the time she hung up, the soup was getting cold and my enthusiasm was waning. "Sorry about that," she said, barely glancing at the meal I had prepared. "Work has been absolutely insane lately. I might have to take more calls this weekend." She picked at her food while scrolling through emails on her phone, making occasional sounds when I tried to start conversations. I felt like I was dining alone, despite sitting across from my own daughter. Saturday brought more of the same. Sarah slept until nearly noon, emerging from her bedroom with another phone glued to her ear and a laptop tucked under her arm. She set up a makeshift office at the kitchen table, spreading papers and files across the surface where we had once done homework together and planned her future. I offered to make breakfast, to run errands, to help with anything she needed, but she waved me off with distracted murmurs about being too busy to think about food. I spent the day wandering around their house like a ghost, straightening things that didn't need straightening, reading magazines I'd already read, watching television shows that couldn't hold my attention. Every room was immaculate, professionally, decorated, and completely devoid of the warmth that I remembered from our old house on Maple Street. There were no family photos on display, no mementos from Sarah's childhood, no evidence that I had ever been an important part of her life. The refrigerator held takeout containers and expensive organic produce, but no school artwork held up with magnets, no hand-drawn Mother's Day cards yellow with age. That evening, Sarah finally emerged from her work cocoon long enough to suggest, "We order Chinese food." We ate in relative silence, her attention still divided between her phone and whatever crisis was demanding her immediate attention. When I asked about her friends, her hobbies, anything that might give me insight into the woman she had become, She gave one-word answers that effectively shut down any possibility of real conversation. "I'm worried about you," I finally said, setting down my chopsticks and looking directly at her. "You seem so stressed, so disconnected from everything except work. When was the last time you did something just for fun?" Sarah looked up from her phone with an expression of mild irritation. "Mom, this is what adult life looks like. Not everyone can coast through life without ambition." The words hit me like a physical blow. Coast through life? Was that how she saw my decades of sacrifice, my years of working multiple jobs to give her opportunities I never had? "I wasn't coasting," I said quietly. "I was surviving and making sure you had every chance to build something better." She sighed, the sound heavy with impatience. "I know you worked hard, Mom, but that was your choice. I never asked you to sacrifice everything for me. And now that I'm successful, I don't understand why you can't just be proud instead of constantly needing attention and validation." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth that I didn't want to acknowledge. Maybe I did need validation. Maybe I did want recognition for the years I had spent putting her needs above my own. But was that really so unreasonable? Was it wrong to want my daughter to remember that her success hadn't materialized out of thin air, that it was built on a foundation of someone else's dreams deferred? Sunday morning brought the conversation that would change everything between us. I woke up early, as I always did, and made coffee in their expensive machine, marveling at how something so simple could be so complicated when it involved multiple buttons and settings I didn't understand. Sarah appeared in the kitchen looking perfectly put together despite having just woken up, her hair styled in a way that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night," she said without preamble, pouring herself coffee in a mug that probably cost more than my entire set of dishes. "I think maybe we need to establish some boundaries." The word boundaries had become popular in her vocabulary lately, usually deployed when she wanted to distance herself from something or someone that didn't fit her new image. I braced myself for whatever was coming next. "I love you, Mom, but I think you're having trouble accepting that I've grown up and moved on. You still treat me like I'm a child who needs constant mothering, and it's becoming suffocating." She delivered this assessment with the clinical detachment of someone discussing a business problem, not a relationship with the person who had raised her. "I don't treat you like a child," I protested. "I just care about you. I want to know how you're doing. What's happening in your life? Is that really so wrong?" "It's not wrong, but it's too much. The constant checking in, the unsolicited advice, the way you act like I owe you something because of the sacrifices you made. It's exhausting." Each word felt carefully chosen, designed to cut deep and establish clear boundaries around her new life. I sat there in her pristine kitchen, holding a mug of coffee that tasted bitter despite the expensive beans, and felt something inside me break. Not dramatically, not with fireworks or tears, but quietly, like a thread snapping under too much tension. This was my daughter, the child I had loved more than my own life, telling me that my love was a burden she could no longer bear. "I see," I said finally, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "So, what exactly are you proposing?" "I think we should limit our contact to special occasions and emergencies. Maybe talk once a month, see each other on holidays. You need to build your own life instead of trying to live vicariously through mine." The irony wasn't lost on me that she was suggesting I build my own life at 62, after spending 43 years building hers. The rest of that Sunday passed in a haze of polite distance. We made small talk about the weather and current events, carefully avoiding any topics that might lead to emotional territory. When it was time for me to leave, Sarah hugged me goodbye with the same enthusiasm she might show a distant relative, promising to be in touch soon in a tone that suggested the opposite. I drove home in silence, my mind churning with everything that had been said, and more importantly, everything that hadn't been said. The house felt different when I walked through the door, smaller, quieter, like a museum of a life that no longer had any relevance to anyone but me. The refrigerator was covered with photos of Sarah at various stages of her life, from gap-toothed kindergartner to college graduate, but looking at them now felt like studying artifacts from someone else's family. That night, I called my sister, Linda, who lived across the country with her own family. We had maintained a cordial but distant relationship over the years, our lives too different and too busy for regular contact. But something about Sarah's dismissal had left me feeling desperate for connection with someone who remembered who I used to be before I became defined entirely by motherhood. "I think I made a mistake," I told Linda after explaining the weekend's events. "I think I loved her too much, gave her too much, made her the center of my universe instead of teaching her to value what she had." Linda was quiet for a long moment, before responding. "You didn't make a mistake, Carol. You made choices based on love. But maybe it's time to start making some choices based on what you need instead of what she wants." Those words stayed with me through the sleepless night that followed. What did I need? I had been so focused on Sarah's needs, Sarah's dreams, Sarah's future, that I had forgotten I was allowed to have my own. At 62, with a modest pension and a small savings account, I still had years ahead of me. The question was whether I wanted to spend them waiting for crumbs of affection from someone who had clearly moved beyond needing me. The months following that painful Sunday conversation passed like pages in a book I didn't want to read but couldn't put down. Sarah kept her word about limited contact, reaching out only when absolutely necessary. A brief text on my birthday, a perfunctory call at Christmas that lasted exactly 12 minutes. I found myself checking the clock during that call, watching. The seconds tick by as she updated me on her work achievements and Marcus's latest business ventures with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. I tried to fill the void with activities that well-meaning friends suggested. I joined a book club at the library, but found myself sitting in circles of women discussing romance novels, while my mind wandered to the daughter who no longer wanted my opinion on anything. I attempted watercolor classes at the community center, but my paintings looked like the work of a melancholy child, all gray skies and empty houses. Even my weekly grocery shopping became an exercise in loneliness. Buying food for one person felt like admitting defeat in some cosmic game I didn't know I was playing. The house on Maple Street, which had once felt like a sanctuary, began to feel like a mausoleum. Every room held memories of Sarah's childhood, but those memories had taken on a bittersweet quality that made me question whether I was remembering things as they actually were or as I wished they had been. The bedroom that had been hers sat, empty, preserved like a shrine to a relationship that no longer existed. Her old furniture, the posters she had carefully selected, the bookshelf full of young adult novels, everything remained exactly as she had left it, waiting for someone who would never return. I started working longer hours at the accounting firm, staying late to organize files that didn't need organizing, taking on projects that others avoided. My colleagues began to worry about me, suggesting I take vacation time I had accumulated over the years. But where would I go? Who would I go with? The cruises and weekend getaways that other women my age enjoyed with their daughters or grandchildren felt like foreign concepts, activities from a life I had never learned to live. One particularly difficult evening in March, I found myself standing in Sarah's old bedroom, looking through photo albums I had meticulously maintained throughout her childhood. Every birthday party, every school play, every graduation was documented, with the obsessive care of someone who believed these moments would matter forever. I realized with startling clarity that I had been the family archivist, the keeper of memories that apparently held significance for no one but me. That was when I discovered the box of letters hidden behind her old desk. Letters I had written to Sarah throughout her teenage years, but never given her. Thoughts I had wanted to share during the difficult periods when communication between us had become strained. Letters about my hopes for her future, my fears about letting her down, my pride in watching her grow into a strong, independent woman. Reading them now felt like conversing with a ghost of myself, a woman who had believed that love alone could bridge any gap. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had spent 43 years preparing Sarah for a life that didn't include me. I had taught her to be independent, self-sufficient, strong enough to succeed without anyone's help, including mine. The very qualities I had worked so hard to instill in her were now the weapons she used to keep me at arm's length. I had raised her to fly away, and then felt abandoned when she did exactly what I had trained her to do. But something else emerged from that painful revelation. A spark of anger that surprised me with its intensity. Not anger at Sarah, exactly, but anger at myself for accepting a relationship built entirely on her terms. For 43 years, I had been the one making all the adjustments, all the accommodations, all the sacrifices. When had I stopped being a person with my own needs and become simply an extension of someone else's life? The turning point came in April, when Sarah called with what she presented as good news. She and Marcus were buying a bigger house, a sprawling suburban mansion with enough space for the family they were planning to start. The excitement in her voice was the most genuine emotion I had heard from her in months, and for a moment I felt hopeful that maybe this change would bring us closer together. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," I said, meaning it. "I'd love to see it sometime." There was a pause, and I could almost hear her internal debate about how to respond. "The thing is, Mom, this house is really important to us. It's our fresh start, and we want to keep it pristine. Maybe once we're settled and have everything exactly how we want it, we can arrange a visit." The message was clear. I was being relegated to the status of a guest who required advance notice and careful preparation, someone whose presence might somehow tarnish their perfect new beginning. But what came next was even more crushing. "Actually, that's part of why I'm calling. We're going to be really busy with the move over the next few months, and then we want to focus on trying for a baby. So I think it's best if we keep our distance for a while. Give us space to figure out our new normal before adding any complications." Complications. That's what I had become in my daughter's life. A complication to be managed rather than a relationship to be nurtured. I absorbed this information with the same numb acceptance that had become my default response to her casual cruelty. But something inside me was changing, hardening like metal in a forge. "I understand," I said, though I didn't understand at all. "Just let me know when you're ready." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen for nearly an hour, staring at the phone and processing what had just happened. My daughter was starting a new chapter of her life, planning to become a mother herself, and she couldn't imagine any role for me in that journey. The grandmother I might become was already being pushed to the margins before the children even existed. That night, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. I called a realtor and inquired about selling the house on Maple Street. If Sarah wanted a fresh start without complications, maybe it was time for me to have a fresh start too. The realtor, an energetic woman named Patricia who specialized in helping empty nesters downsize, came by the following week. She walked through the house with professional efficiency, noting good bones and original hardwood floors, but I could see her mental calculations about the work that would be needed to make it appealing to modern buyers. The kitchen hadn't been updated since the 1990s, the bathrooms were functional but dated, and the whole house had the worn-around-the-edges look of a place where someone had been too busy raising a child to worry about home improvement. "It's a solid house with good potential," Patricia told me diplomatically. "With some strategic updates, we could probably get you a decent price. But may I ask why you're thinking of selling? It's clear this house has a lot of sentimental value." I looked around the living room where Sarah had taken her first steps, the kitchen where we had baked countless birthday cakes, the staircase where she had posed for prom photos. "The sentiment is exactly the problem," I said finally. I think I need to live somewhere that doesn't feel like a museum. Patricia nodded with the understanding of someone who had guided many clients through similar transitions. Have you thought about what kind of place you'd like to move to? Condo? Smaller house? Retirement community? Retirement community. The phrase made me wince. At 62, I wasn't ready to be warehoused with other people whose children had outgrown them. But the conversation planted a seed that began to grow over the following weeks. What kind of life did I want to build for myself? For the first time in decades, the answer didn't have to revolve around Sarah's needs or preferences. I started researching possibilities with the same methodical approach I had once used to plan Sarah's education. There were active adult communities, with golf courses and social activities, urban condos within walking distance of theaters and restaurants, even opportunities to relocate to entirely different climates where I could reinvent myself completely. The world suddenly seemed full of possibilities I had never allowed myself to consider. But before I could move forward with any major life changes, Sarah delivered news that would shift everything between us once again. She called on a Thursday evening in May, her voice tight with stress and exhaustion. "Mom, I need to ask you a favor," she said without preamble. "Marcus's mother was supposed to come stay with us next week. She's been helping us get the new house organized, but she fell and broke her hip. We really need someone to help with some things, and I know you said you wanted to see the new place." There it was, the opening I had been waiting for, the chance to be needed again. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the months of distance and dismissal, my heart leaped at the opportunity to be useful to my daughter once more. All thoughts of selling the house and starting fresh evaporated in the face of Sarah's need, even if that need was clearly born of desperation rather than desire for my company. "Of course I'll help," I said immediately. "What do you need me to do?" "Well, there are boxes to unpack and the cleaning lady canceled, and I have this huge work presentation next week that I can't postpone. If you could just come for a few days and help us get organized, it would be such a relief." I should have recognized the warning signs in her tone, the way she framed it as a temporary inconvenience rather than an opportunity to spend time together, the emphasis on tasks rather than relationship. But I was so hungry for connection with my daughter that I ignored every red flag and focused only on the invitation itself. "When would you like me to come?" I asked, already mentally packing my suitcase. "Could you come Sunday and stay through Wednesday? I know it's not ideal timing, but we're just so overwhelmed with everything." Not ideal timing. As if I had a social calendar full of competing obligations rather than long, empty days that I filled with meaningless activities to avoid confronting my loneliness. But I pushed aside the hurt and focused on the practical details, the arrangements, that would allow me to be helpful to my daughter once again. Sunday morning found me standing on the front steps of Sarah and Marcus's new house, an imposing colonial that looked like something from a magazine spread. The lawn was perfectly manicured, the driveway wide enough for multiple luxury cars, the front door flanked by urns filled with seasonal flowers that had clearly been professionally arranged. This was the life Sarah had built for herself, the culmination of all my sacrifices and her own hard work, and I felt a familiar mixture of pride and inadequacy as I rang the doorbell. Sarah answered wearing designer workout clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail that somehow managed to look effortlessly elegant. She greeted me with a quick hug and immediately began outlining the tasks she needed me to tackle, her attention already divided between my arrival and the phone calls she was fielding from work. The house was stunning but sterile, all neutral colors and clean lines that felt more like a hotel lobby than a family home. Moving boxes were stacked in every room, labeled with Marcus's precise handwriting in categories I didn't recognize. The kitchen was a marvel of modern appliances and granite surfaces, but it felt cold and unwelcoming despite its obvious luxury. "I've put you in the guest room upstairs," Sarah said, leading me through a maze of boxes and furniture covered in Protective plastic. The bed's not made up yet. I just haven't had time. But there are sheets in the linen closet. I really appreciate you doing this, Mom. I know it's not exactly a fun way to spend your week. The guest room was spacious but impersonal, with furniture that looked expensive but uncomfortable, and windows that faced the neighbor's brick wall. I unpacked my small suitcase into a dresser that smelled of new wood and chemical finishes, hanging my simple clothes in a closet that seemed designed for a much more sophisticated wardrobe than mine. The first 3 days at Sarah's new house passed in a blur of manual labor and emotional distance. I unpacked boxes labeled formal dinnerware and crystal stemware, items that cost more than my monthly pension, carefully arranging them in cabinets I would never be invited to access again. Each piece I unwrapped felt like a small artifact, from a life I had helped make possible but was no longer welcome to share. Sarah worked from her temporary home office, a converted bedroom where she took endless conference calls about marketing campaigns and client presentations. Marcus was traveling for business, leaving me alone with my daughter for the first time in months. But somehow his absence made the distance between us feel even more pronounced. When we were both in the kitchen, we moved around each other like polite strangers, exchanging pleasantries about the weather while carefully avoiding any conversation that might venture into emotional territory. I threw myself into the physical work with an intensity that surprised both of us. Years of taking care of others had taught me how to find satisfaction in making spaces beautiful and functional, and despite the emotional cost, I took pride in transforming their chaotic moving mess into an organized home. The kitchen began to hum with efficiency as I arranged their expensive gadgets and organized their pantry with the precision of someone who understood how to make the most of limited resources. But as Tuesday night approached, the temperature began to drop dramatically. Michigan in November could be brutal, and their new house, despite its impressive appearance, seemed to struggle with the sudden cold snap. I mentioned the chill to Sarah as we ate takeout dinner at their dining room table, but she was distracted by work emails, barely acknowledging my comment with a distracted while typing responses on her phone. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, shivering despite wearing all the clothes I had packed. The heating system seemed to be working in other parts of the house. I could hear the furnace running, but my room remained stubbornly cold. When I investigated, I discovered that the heating vent in my room had been closed, and worse, there seemed to be an issue with the ductwork that prevented proper heat distribution to the entire upstairs area. Wednesday morning, I woke up with a stiff neck and aching joints from a night spent trying to stay warm under inadequate blankets. When I mentioned the heating issue to Sarah over coffee, her response revealed exactly how little thought she had given to my comfort. "Oh, that room always runs cold," she said casually, not looking up from her laptop screen. The previous owners mentioned something about ductwork problems upstairs, but we haven't had time to get it fixed yet. Marcus says it's not a priority since we don't usually have overnight guests. The casual cruelty of that statement hit me like ice water. I wasn't a guest in any meaningful sense. I was free labor, someone brought in to handle the tasks that Sarah couldn't be bothered with, and my comfort was so low on their priority list that they hadn't even bothered to ensure I had adequate heating while working in their home for 3 days. But what came next was the moment that would change everything between us forever. "Actually, Mom, I have some bad news," Sarah continued, still typing while she delivered information that would shatter what remained of our relationship. "Marcus called this morning. His business trip got extended through the weekend, and I just remembered I have that conference in Chicago starting tomorrow. I know you were planning to leave today, but would you mind staying a few more days? The house isn't quite ready to be left alone yet, and it would be such a huge help if you could just keep an eye on things." I stared at her across their granite kitchen island, processing what she was actually asking. She wanted me to stay alone in their house, in a room without proper heating, to serve as an unpaid house sitter while she attended a conference and her husband traveled for business. The casual way she framed this request, as if it were a minor inconvenience rather than a fundamental disrespect for my time and comfort, revealed everything I needed to know about how she viewed our relationship. "Sarah," I said carefully, "the upstairs is really cold. If I'm going to stay longer, we need to do something about the heating situation." She finally looked up from her laptop, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the old Sarah, the one who used to care about my well-being. But it was quickly replaced by the practical, efficient version of my daughter who had learned to prioritize convenience over compassion. "The basement guest room has its own space heater," she said, as if this solved everything. "It's actually quite cozy down there. I used to study there sometimes when I was in high school and needed quiet space." I felt something crack inside my chest. She was suggesting that I, her 62-year-old mother who had spent 3 days doing manual labor in her house, should sleep in an unfinished basement with a space heater while she attended conferences, and her husband conducted business in climate-controlled hotels. "The basement?" I repeated, wanting to make sure I had heard correctly. "It's really not that bad, Mom. There's a fold-out couch and everything. Plus, you'll be warmer down there than upstairs." She was already back to typing, having dismissed my comfort as thoroughly as she had dismissed my feelings for the past year. That evening, after Sarah had left for the airport with a quick kiss on my cheek and a list of instructions for watering plants and collecting mail, I found myself standing at the top of the basement stairs, looking down into the dimly lit space that my daughter considered adequate accommodation for the woman who had raised her. The basement was exactly what I had expected: concrete floors, exposed pipes, the smell of dampness and storage. The guest room was a corner sectioned off with a cheap room divider, containing a fold-out couch that had seen better days, a space heater that looked like a fire hazard, and a card table with a lamp that cast harsh shadows on the concrete walls. This was where my daughter thought I should sleep for the next 4 days while she lived in luxury elsewhere. I stood there for a long time, my overnight bag in my hand, trying to understand how we had arrived at this moment. This wasn't just about inadequate accommodations. This was about a fundamental lack of respect that had been building for months, maybe years. My daughter had become someone who could ask her mother to sleep in a basement and think it was perfectly reasonable. But instead of descending those stairs, instead of accepting this final indignity in a long series of small humiliations, I set my bag down and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for: the utility company that provided heating and electricity to Sarah's beautiful new house. "Hello," I said when the customer service representative answered. "I need to transfer utility service to a new name. The account holder is moving and asked me to handle the details." The process was surprisingly simple. Sarah had never removed my name from the account as an authorized user, a remnant from the days when I helped her manage her finances during college. With a few pieces of information and a story about Sarah being too busy with work to handle the transfer herself, I was able to change the billing responsibility for the heating bill to my own name and address. But here's where my plan took a turn that even I hadn't fully anticipated. Instead of simply taking over the payments, I called back and requested that the service be temporarily suspended due to non-payment issues that needed to be resolved. The representative assured me that service would be restored once the account was brought current, but in the meantime, the heating would be shut off within 24 hours. Then I made a second call, this time to a locksmith service that offered emergency key replacement. Using information I had gathered from mail sitting on their kitchen counter, I was able to schedule a lock change for the following morning, explaining that the homeowners were concerned about security after their moving crew had included some questionable characters. The final call was to a storage facility where I arranged for a truck to pick up specific items from the house. Items that belonged to me, things I had given Sarah over the years that held sentimental value but clearly meant nothing to her. The antique rocking chair that had belonged to my mother, the hand-painted china set I had saved for months to give her as a wedding gift, the photo albums documenting her childhood that she had never even looked at in her new house. That night, I slept in the master bedroom, in the comfortable king-size bed with luxury linens and perfect temperature control. If I was going to spend one more night in this house, it would be in comfort befitting someone who had worked for 3 days without compensation or consideration. The next morning, I woke up early and began implementing my plan with the methodical precision I had once used to organize Sarah's school schedule and college applications. I packed my belongings, along with the items I was reclaiming, into boxes that the storage company would collect later. I left a detailed note on the kitchen counter, written in my careful handwriting on Sarah's expensive stationery. "Dear Sarah," the note began, "I want you to know that I understand exactly what happened here. You asked me to stay in your basement because you believed I would accept any treatment you chose to give me, just as I have accepted your growing disrespect for the past year. You were wrong." I continued writing, my hand steady despite the magnitude of what I was doing. "I have taken the liberty of transferring the heating bill to my name, which means that as of today, you are responsible for arranging your own heating service. I have also changed the locks, since you made it clear that I am not welcome as anything more than free labor. The new keys are with your neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who seemed like a lovely woman when I met her yesterday." The note went on to explain that I had removed only items that belonged to me, things I had given her as gifts that clearly held no value in her current life. I informed her that I would be selling the house on Maple Street and using the proceeds to build a life that didn't revolve around waiting for crumbs of affection from someone who had forgotten the value of family. "You have achieved everything I ever wanted for you," I wrote in closing. "You are successful, independent, and strong enough to handle whatever challenges life brings. You no longer need a mother, and I no longer need to pretend that being dismissed and diminished is the same thing as being loved." I signed the note simply Carol, not Mom, not Love Mom, just my name, the name of the woman I was before I became defined entirely by my relationship to her. The locksmith arrived at 9 o'clock. A friendly man named Joe who made small talk about the neighborhood while installing new deadbolts and changing the garage door codes. The storage truck came at 10:30, and I supervised the loading of my belongings with the same attention to detail I had once applied to packing Sarah's college dorm room. By noon, I was driving away from the suburban palace that my daughter called home, my car loaded with the remnants of a relationship that had been slowly dying for months. I didn't look back as I turned out of their neighborhood, but I did roll down the windows despite the cold air, breathing deeply as if emerging from underwater. The heating would be shut off by evening, and Sarah would return from her conference to a house as cold as the treatment she had shown me. She would have to figure out how to restore service, how to get new keys, how to handle the inconveniences of adult life without a mother standing by to smooth every rough edge. But this wasn't just about revenge, though I won't pretend that. The thought of Sarah shivering in her basement didn't bring me a certain satisfaction. This was about reclaiming my dignity, about refusing to accept a relationship built entirely on her terms and my accommodation. I drove straight to Patricia's real estate office and signed the listing agreement for my house on Maple Street. Then I went to a nearby hotel, a modest but comfortable place where I checked in for a week while I figured out my next steps. The room was small but warm, with a view of the city skyline and room service that delivered hot soup without judgment or conditions. That evening, my phone began ringing. First Sarah, then Marcus, then Sarah again. I let every call go to voicemail, listening later to increasingly frantic messages that revealed exactly how unprepared they were to handle even minor inconveniences without someone else cleaning up their messes. "Mom, what the hell did you do?" Sarah's voice was tight with panic and disbelief. "The heat is off and we can't get into the house and the storage company said you authorized them to take things? Call me back immediately. This is insane." But I didn't call back. For the first time in 43 years, my daughter's crisis was not my emergency to solve. I ordered room service and watched a movie I had wanted to see for months, wrapped in a soft hotel robe with the temperature set exactly where I wanted it. The transformation wasn't complete yet. There would be more conversations, more consequences, more adjustments to this new reality where I was no longer willing to be taken for granted. But sitting in that warm hotel room, listening to my daughter's voicemails that revealed her complete shock at my refusal to remain invisible and accommodating, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt powerful. Not cruel, not vindictive, but powerful in the quiet way of someone who had finally remembered that they deserved better than the scraps of affection thrown by people who expected everything and gave nothing in return. The heating bill would be resolved eventually. The locks would be changed back or new arrangements made. But the message I had sent would remain clear. The woman who had spent decades accepting mistreatment in the name of love was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real love required mutual respect, not just endless sacrifice. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I fell asleep easily, warm and comfortable, and completely at peace with the choices I had made. The week I spent in that hotel was a revelation. Each morning, I woke up to silence that belonged entirely to me. No phone calls requesting favors, no guilt about not being useful enough, no careful navigation around someone else's mood or schedule. I ordered breakfast from room service not because I was too tired to cook, but because I wanted to experience the simple luxury of being served by someone who was paid to be kind to me. My phone continued to ring throughout that first week, but the tenor of the messages evolved in ways that told me everything I needed to know about how Sarah viewed our relationship. The initial panic gave way to anger, then frustration, then finally a kind of bewildered hurt that suggested she was beginning to understand that this wasn't a temporary tantrum she could wait out. "Mom, I don't understand what you're trying to prove," one message said. "We got the heat turned back on, but the whole situation was incredibly embarrassing. Marcus had to take time off work to deal with the locksmith, and I had to cut my conference short. If you were upset about something, why couldn't you just talk to me like an adult instead of creating this drama?" The irony of being accused of not acting like an adult by someone who had asked me to sleep in a basement while she traveled for work was not lost on me. But what struck me most was her complete inability to connect my actions with her treatment of me. In her mind, I had created a crisis out of nowhere, rather than responded to months of being taken for granted. I spent those hotel days doing something I hadn't done in decades. I planned a life that revolved around my own interests and desires. I researched volunteer opportunities at literacy programs, looked into continuing education courses that had always intrigued me, and investigated travel options for someone on a fixed income who wanted to see parts of the world she had only read about in books. The house on Maple Street sold faster than Patricia had predicted, to a young couple with 2 small children who saw potential in the worn edges and dated fixtures that I had always been too busy to update. Watching them walk through the rooms, where Sarah had grown up, pointing excitedly at the built-in breakfast nook and the treehouse visible from the back window, I felt a bittersweet sense of completion. This house would once again be filled with the sounds of family life. But this time, I wouldn't be the one sacrificing my own needs to make it happen. With the proceeds from the sale, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. I bought a small condominium in a retirement community 2 hours away, far enough to require intentional effort to visit, but close enough that I wasn't completely severing ties with the life I had built. The community wasn't the stereotypical warehouse for forgotten elderly people I had feared. Instead, it was full of vibrant, active adults who had decided to prioritize their own happiness in the later chapters of their lives. My new neighbor, a retired teacher named Margaret who had raised 4 children before discovering her passion for photography at age 65, became my first real friend in years. She understood the complicated emotions of loving adult children who had outgrown their need for constant maternal attention without becoming cruel in their independence. The hardest part, Margaret told me over coffee in my new kitchen, is learning that being a good mother doesn't mean accepting poor treatment. Some of us raised our children so well that they don't need us anymore, and that's actually a success, not a failure. The failure is in forgetting that we still deserve respect and kindness. 3 weeks after I moved into my new home, Sarah appeared at my door unannounced. She had clearly expected to find me still living on Maple Street, still available for the kind of surprise visit that used to send me into a flurry of cooking and cleaning to make her feel welcome. Instead, she found herself standing in an unfamiliar hallway, looking lost and somehow smaller than I remembered. "Mom," she said, and I heard something in her voice I hadn't heard in years: uncertainty. "Mrs. Patterson gave me your new address. Can we talk?" I invited her in, but this time I didn't rush to offer food or drinks or any of the hosting behaviors that had once defined our interactions. We sat in my new living room, furnished with pieces I had chosen for comfort rather than impression, and I waited for her to explain why she had driven 2 hours to see me. "I've been thinking about what happened," she began, then stopped, clearly struggling with how to proceed. "Marcus thinks I should just write you off, that you've obviously had some kind of breakdown and it's not worth the drama. But I keep thinking about that note you left, about how you felt dismissed and diminished." She paused, looking around my new space with what appeared to be genuine confusion. "I never meant to make you feel that way. I thought I was just being independent, like you taught me to be." For the first time in months, I heard something genuine in her voice, a crack in the polished veneer she had been presenting to the world. But I had learned not to rush in to make her feel better, not to smooth over difficult conversations before they had a chance to create real understanding. "Independence doesn't require cruelty, Sarah," I said quietly. "You can build your own life without treating the people who love you like they're disposable." "I never treated you like you were disposable," she protested. But even as she said it, I could see her mentally reviewing our recent interactions. I needed space. I needed to figure out who I was as an adult without feeling like I was constantly disappointing you." "Disappointing me how?" I asked, genuinely curious. "What did I ever do to make you feel like you were disappointing me?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She sat in silence for several minutes, and I watched her face cycle through, a range of emotions as she tried to articulate feelings she had apparently never examined closely. "You sacrificed so much for me," she said finally. "Everything you did was about giving me opportunities you never had. And I felt like nothing I accomplished was really mine. Like I was just living out your dreams instead of my own." The admission hung in the air between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. I felt the familiar urge to reassure her, to minimize her feelings and take responsibility for her discomfort. But something had changed in me during those weeks of living entirely for myself, and I resisted the impulse to make her feel better at my own expense. "I'm sorry you felt that way," I said instead. "But feeling guilty about my sacrifices doesn't justify treating me poorly. If you needed space to figure out your own identity, you could have asked for it respectfully instead of gradually pushing me out of your life." "I didn't know how," she said, and for a moment she looked like the confused teenager she had once been, struggling with emotions too big for words. "Every time I tried to establish boundaries, you looked so hurt that I felt terrible. It seemed easier to just pull away gradually." "Easier for you," I corrected. "Not easier for me." I spent months wondering what I had done wrong, thinking that if I just tried harder or needed less, you might want me in your life again. We talked for 2 hours that afternoon, the longest honest conversation we had shared in years. Sarah admitted that she had come to see my love as a burden rather than a gift, something that required constant management rather than simple appreciation. She acknowledged that asking me to sleep in the basement had been wrong, though she claimed it hadn't occurred to her at the time how demeaning the request was. "I think I stopped seeing you as a person," she said, the words clearly difficult to speak. "You were just Mom." always available, always willing to help, always putting my needs first. I forgot that you had feelings that could be hurt. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get, and while it didn't erase the months of pain and diminishment, it was a beginning. But I had learned something important during my weeks of independence. Forgiveness didn't have to mean returning to old patterns that hadn't served either of us. I appreciate you saying that, I told her. And I want you to know that I still love you. But things can't go back to the way they were. I won't be available whenever you need something. And I won't accept being treated as an afterthought in your life. The conversation ended with tentative plans to have dinner the following month, a careful step toward rebuilding a relationship on more equal terms. Sarah left looking thoughtful rather than satisfied, which seemed appropriate for someone who was finally beginning to understand that actions have consequences even in family relationships. Over the following months, we developed a new rhythm that felt healthier for both of us. We spoke on the phone once a week, planned visits in advance, and treated each other with the courtesy we might show good friends, rather than taking each other for granted. Sarah made genuine efforts to ask about my life, my new activities, my thoughts on subjects that had nothing to do with her needs or problems. The changes weren't always smooth. There were moments when she reverted to old patterns, calling with last-minute requests or assumptions about my availability that I had to gently correct. There were times when I felt the old pull to over-accommodate, to say yes to things that didn't serve me just to maintain peace. But we were both learning new ways of being in relationship that honored both our independence and our love for each other. 6 months after our conversation in my living room, Sarah called with news that she was pregnant. The old me would have immediately offered to move back closer to provide whatever support she needed during her pregnancy and beyond. Instead, I congratulated her warmly and asked how she was feeling, treating her news as something to celebrate, rather than a crisis that required my intervention. I was wondering, she said carefully, if you might want to be involved with the baby. Not in an overwhelming way, but I've been thinking about what kind of grandmother I'd want my child to have, and I realized I want them to know you. The real you, not just the version of you that always said yes to everything. It was an invitation rather than an assumption, a request rather than a demand. And for the first time in years, I felt genuinely excited about the prospect of being part of Sarah's family rather than just useful to it. I would love that, I told her. And I think this baby is going to be lucky to have a mother who's learning the difference between love and sacrifice. My new life wasn't perfect, but it was mine in ways that my old life had never been. I volunteered at the literacy center 3 days a week, helping women my age get their GEDs and discover possibilities they had never allowed themselves to imagine. I took art classes and discovered I had a talent for pottery, creating pieces that were beautiful precisely because they were imperfect, shaped by hands that had learned to value authenticity over perfection. I traveled for the first time in my adult life, taking a bus tour through New England to see the fall foliage, staying in bed and breakfasts where I was treated as a valued guest rather than free labor. I made friends with other women who had reached the stage of life where they refused to shrink themselves to make others comfortable. The heating bill incident, as it came to be known in my new circle of friends, had become something of a legend. Margaret loved to tell the story at our monthly potluck dinners, always ending with the moral that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is teach people that their actions have consequences. You didn't abandon your daughter, she would say. You showed her what it looks like when someone has enough self-respect to demand better treatment. That's a gift that will serve her well in every relationship she has for the rest of her life. A year after moving to my new community, I received a card from Sarah that simply said, "Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't have to hurt." Inside, she had included a photo of her growing belly and a note that said, "I'm going to teach this baby that grandmothers are people who deserve respect and kindness, not just service." It wasn't the relationship I had once imagined having. With my adult daughter, But it was better. It was built on mutual respect rather than obligation, on genuine affection rather than guilt and manipulation. And most importantly, it was a relationship where both people mattered, where love flowed in both directions, instead of being a one-way river that left one person depleted and the other person entitled. The woman who had once accepted sleeping in a basement rather than risk confrontation was gone, replaced by someone who understood that teaching people how to treat you is one of the most loving things you can do. Not just for yourself, but for them. Because respect is a skill that serves everyone well. As I sat in my warm, comfortable home, surrounded by friends who valued my opinions, and a daughter who was finally learning to appreciate my presence rather than just my usefulness, I realized that the heating bill had been the least important part of the whole story. The real transformation had been learning to generate my own warmth, to create a life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or affection for its value. And in the end, that was the greatest gift I could have given both of us. The call came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October, almost 2 years after I had walked away from Sarah's house with my dignity intact and my future wide open. I was in my pottery studio, a converted spare bedroom where I spent mornings creating pieces that local galleries had begun featuring in their collections. The clay was wet between my fingers, and I was lost in the meditative rhythm of shaping something beautiful from raw earth when my phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, but this wasn't one of our scheduled weekly calls. My heart did a small flutter of concern. Pregnancy complications, perhaps, or trouble with Marcus. But when I answered, her voice carried an emotion I hadn't heard from her in years, genuine excitement mixed with something that sounded almost like awe. "Mom, the baby came early. 3 weeks early, but she's perfect. She's absolutely perfect." Sarah's voice was thick with exhaustion and wonder, the particular combination that comes with new motherhood. Her name is Grace Catherine, and Mom, she has your eyes. The same gray-blue that photographs never capture properly. Grace Catherine, a name that spoke of elegance and strength, qualities I hoped this little girl would inherit not just from her genetics, but from the lessons her mother was still learning about self-respect and boundaries. I set down my clay-covered hands and felt tears spring to my eyes, not the complicated tears of obligation and guilt that had once defined my relationship with Sarah, but pure joy for this new life and this new chapter. "Congratulations, sweetheart," I said, meaning it completely. "How are you feeling? How is she doing?" "She's tiny but strong, 5 pounds, 2 ounces, but her lungs work perfectly and she's already trying to lift her head." Sarah laughed, a sound of pure delight that reminded me of the girl she had been before life became so complicated between us. "Mom, I was wondering, would you like to come meet her? Not right away. I know you have your art class on Thursdays, and I don't want to disrupt your schedule, but maybe this weekend?" The invitation was perfect in its consideration. Sarah had remembered my pottery class, had thought about my schedule as something that mattered rather than something to be worked around. She was asking rather than assuming, requesting rather than demanding. These small courtesies might seem insignificant to someone else, but to me they represented a complete transformation in how my daughter viewed my time and autonomy. "I would love nothing more," I told her. "Should I bring anything specific?" "Just yourself," she said quickly. "I mean, if you want to bring something, that's lovely, but I mostly just want Grace to meet her grandmother. I want her to know you as the woman you are now, not just as someone who exists to help other people." 2 days later, I drove the familiar route to Sarah's house, but this time the journey felt entirely different. I wasn't traveling as someone summoned to provide free labor or emotional support. I was going as an honored guest, invited to meet the newest member of our family. My car held carefully chosen gifts: a hand-knitted blanket I had made during quiet evenings, a children's book of poetry I had discovered at a local bookstore, and a framed photograph of my own mother holding Sarah as a newborn, a connection between generations that suddenly felt precious rather than burdensome. The house looked different too, though nothing physical had changed. The perfectly manicured lawn and imposing colonial structure were the same, but my relationship to this space had been fundamentally altered. I wasn't approaching as a supplicant hoping for scraps of affection. I was arriving as someone whose presence was genuinely wanted. Marcus answered the door, and his greeting surprised me with its warmth. "Carol, it's so good to see you. Sarah's been looking forward to this all week." He looked tired but happy, wearing casual clothes that showed evidence of new parent life. A small stain on his shirt that would have horrified the old Marcus, hair that hadn't been perfectly styled. Parenthood was already teaching him that some things mattered more than appearances. "Thank you for having me," I replied, and meant it. This felt like a real invitation to a real relationship, not the performative family gatherings that had once characterized our interactions. Sarah emerged from the living room carrying a tiny bundle wrapped in pink and white, her face glowing with the particular radiance of a woman who had just accomplished something miraculous. She looked different, softer somehow, more connected, to something larger than her own ambitions and image. Motherhood was revealing aspects of her personality that had been buried under years of professional achievement and social positioning. "Mom, meet Grace," she said, and placed the baby in my arms with complete trust. Grace was exquisite in the way that all newborns are, but holding her felt different from my memories of holding Sarah's friends' children over the years. This wasn't obligatory baby holding to be polite. This was meeting my granddaughter, a person who would carry forward pieces of all of us into a future we couldn't yet imagine. Her tiny fingers wrapped around my thumb with surprising strength, and when she opened her eyes, those gray-blue eyes Sarah had mentioned, she seemed to look directly at me with ancient wisdom. "Hello, sweet girl," I whispered. "I'm your Grandma Carol, and I've been waiting to meet you for a very long time." We spent the afternoon in Sarah's living room, but the atmosphere was completely different from my last visit to this house. Instead of feeling like an unwelcome intruder, I was treated as an honored guest. Sarah had prepared lunch herself. Nothing elaborate, just sandwiches and soup. But she had made the effort to cook for me rather than ordering takeout. Marcus took photos of 3 generations of women, commenting on the family resemblance he could already see in Grace's expressions. But the most remarkable change was in how Sarah talked about her hopes and fears for motherhood. Instead of the confident pronouncements about parenting that I might have expected from someone who had spent years managing every aspect of her life with professional efficiency, she spoke with vulnerability and genuine curiosity about what kind of mother she wanted to become. "I keep thinking about all the things you did for me," she said while Grace napped in my arms. "Not just the big sacrifices, but the small daily things. The way you always had dinner ready when I got home from school, even when you'd been working all day. The way you listened to every detail about my friends and teachers and classes, even when your own day had been terrible." She paused, watching her daughter's sleeping face with wonder. "I used to take all of that for granted. I thought that was just what mothers did automatically, like breathing. Now I realize how much intention and energy went into making my childhood feel safe and loved." "You're going to find your own way to love her," I assured her. "You don't have to parent exactly like I did. Some of my choices were good, and some were probably mistakes I made because I didn't know any better." "What would you do differently?" Sarah asked, and the question felt like an opportunity for honest reflection rather than a test with right and wrong answers. I considered carefully before answering. "I think I would have taught you earlier that love doesn't require sacrifice of everything that makes you who you are. I gave up so much of myself that I forgot I was allowed to have needs and interests that weren't about you. That probably taught you that mothers exist only to serve others, which isn't healthy for anyone." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I want Grace to see me as a whole person, not just as someone who exists to meet her needs. I want her to respect the people who love her, not just expect them to be available whenever she wants something. It was a profound shift in perspective, one that suggested Sarah was beginning to understand that raising a confident, capable child didn't require erasing yourself as a parent. We talked about practical things too, feeding schedules and sleep patterns and the overwhelming responsibility of caring for someone so vulnerable. But underneath all the logistics was a deeper conversation about values and priorities. Over the following months, I settled into a role as grandmother that felt healthy and sustainable for everyone involved. I visited every few weeks, always by invitation and always with specific plans that respected everyone's time and energy. Sometimes I came for a few hours to hold Grace while Sarah showered or napped. Sometimes I stayed overnight to help with night feedings, sleeping in the properly heated guest room that Sarah had insisted on having repaired before my first visit. But I also maintained boundaries that the old me never would have considered. When Sarah asked if I could babysit on short notice so she and Marcus could attend a last-minute work event, I gently declined, explaining that I had plans with my pottery group that I wasn't willing to cancel. When she suggested I might want to move closer to help with childcare, I thanked her for thinking of me, but explained that I loved my new community and the life I had built there. These small acts of self-preservation might have caused conflict in our old relationship, but Sarah accepted them with grace that showed how much she had grown. "I'm glad you have your own life," she told me after I declined the babysitting request. "I want Grace to see that grandmothers are interesting people, with their own friends and hobbies, not just emergency childcare." My relationship with Grace developed beautifully precisely because it wasn't built on obligation or desperation for connection. When I held her, it was because I wanted to spend time with my granddaughter, not because I was trying to prove my worth as a family member. When I sang to her or read stories or played peekaboo, it was pure joy rather than performance designed to secure my place in her life. Grace thrived under this kind of healthy family dynamic. Even as a baby, she seemed to sense the difference between adults who respected each other and adults who operated from guilt and manipulation. She was calm with all of us, secure in the knowledge that she was loved without being the center of a universe that revolved entirely around her needs. When Grace was 6 months old, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She announced that she was taking an extended maternity leave and potentially shifting to part-time work when she did return to her career. "I realized that I was making the same mistake with Grace that I made with you," she explained during one of our weekend visits. "I was so focused on providing financial security and impressive achievements that I was missing the actual relationship. I don't want to wake up in 20 years and discover that my daughter thinks of me as a stranger who paid for her education but never really knew her." It was a profound recognition that success couldn't be measured only in salary figures and professional accomplishments. Sarah was choosing to prioritize connection over advancement, presence over productivity. Lessons that had taken her decades to learn, but that would benefit Grace from the very beginning of her life. Marcus supported the decision completely, having had his own revelation about work-life balance during those first months of fatherhood. "I used to think that being a good provider meant working as many hours as possible and earning as much money as possible," he told me. "But Grace doesn't need designer clothes and expensive toys. She needs parents who are present and engaged and happy to be with her." Watching Sarah navigate early motherhood with intention and mindfulness rather than martyrdom filled me with pride that felt entirely different from the pride I had once taken in her achievements. This wasn't pride in her accomplishments or success. This was pride in her growth as a human being, her willingness to examine her own patterns and make changes that served her family's well-being rather than external expectations. One afternoon in late spring, when Grace was almost a year old and beginning to pull herself up on furniture, Sarah and I were sitting in her backyard, watching the baby explore grass and flowers with the focused intensity that toddlers bring to everything. Sarah had been quiet for a while, lost in thought as she watched her daughter discover the world. "I owe you an apology," she said suddenly, Not just for the basement thing, though that was terrible. I owe you an apology for all the years I treated your love like it was my right rather than your gift. I looked at my daughter, really, looked at her, and saw someone who had traveled a long distance from the woman who had casually suggested I sleep in a cold basement while she attended conferences. This Sarah was thoughtful, intentional, capable of seeing beyond her own immediate needs to consider how her actions affected others. You don't owe me an apology for growing up, I told her. You owe yourself the promise that you'll remember these lessons when Grace starts testing boundaries and asserting her independence. I will, she said firmly. I want her to know that she can build her own life without destroying the people who love her. I want her to understand that independence and cruelty are completely different things. As Grace took her wobbly first steps between us that afternoon, tottering from her mother's arms to mine with determination and delight, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with anyone else's achievements or approval. This little girl would grow up in a family that had learned hard lessons about respect and boundaries, about the difference between love and sacrifice, about the importance of treating people as whole human beings rather than functions in someone else's life. The woman who had once accepted inadequate heating and basement accommodations rather than risk conflict was gone, replaced by someone who understood that dignity wasn't negotiable and that self-respect was a gift to everyone who loved her. Grace would never know that version of her grandmother, the one who had shrunk herself to avoid confrontation. Instead, she would know a woman who had learned to take up appropriate space in the world, who had opinions and interests and boundaries that deserved respect. And in teaching Sarah how to treat her better, I had also taught Grace's future mother how to raise a daughter who would never have to choose between being loved and being respected. That, more than any inheritance or family heirloom, was the legacy I wanted to leave behind. 5 years had passed since Grace's birth, and the little girl who now ran through Sarah's backyard with the fearless energy of a kindergartner bore no resemblance to the helpless infant I had first held with such wonder. Grace had inherited more than just my eyes. She had somehow absorbed the best qualities from all the women in our family line while avoiding the patterns of self-sacrifice that had defined previous generations. At 5 years old, Grace was already demonstrating a healthy sense of self that amazed me. When she wanted something, she asked for it directly, rather than manipulating or whining. When she was told no, she might be disappointed, but she accepted the boundary without the kind of dramatic protests that I remembered from Sarah's childhood. Most remarkably, she seemed to understand instinctively that other people had needs and feelings that mattered just as much as her own. "Grandma Carol," she said to me during one of my monthly visits, "Mommy seems sad today. Should we make her some tea and cookies?" At 5, she was already more emotionally intuitive than many adults I knew, able to recognize when someone needed care without being asked to provide it. Sarah had evolved into the kind of mother I had always hoped to be, but never quite managed. Present without being smothering, loving without being martyred, protective without being controlling. She had learned to say no to Grace when necessary, to set boundaries that served the whole family, rather than just trying to make her daughter happy in the moment. I used to think that being a good mother meant never disappointing your child. Sarah told me one afternoon while we watched Grace build elaborate block towers with the focused concentration of an architect. But I'm learning that disappointment is just part of life, and teaching her to handle it gracefully is actually a gift. This wisdom had extended far beyond her parenting. Sarah had become someone who understood that relationships worked best when everyone's needs were considered, not just when one person accommodated endlessly while others took whatever they wanted. She checked in on my life with genuine interest, remembered the names of my friends from the retirement community, and asked thoughtful questions about my pottery and volunteer work. The transformation hadn't been easy for her. Breaking decades-old patterns of entitlement and assumption had required conscious effort and frequent self-correction. There had been moments when she slipped back into treating my time as infinitely flexible, or my emotional labor as free. But now she caught herself and apologized genuinely rather than getting defensive when I pointed out the problem. "I still catch myself expecting you to just handle things for me," she admitted during one of our conversations. "Yesterday, I started to call and ask if you could pick up Grace from school because I had a work crisis, and then I stopped myself and thought, why is Mom's schedule less important than mine?" So, I figured out another solution. These moments of self-awareness represented profound growth for someone who had spent years believing that her needs automatically took precedence over everyone else's. Sarah was learning to see other people as complex individuals with their own priorities, rather than supporting characters in her life story. My own life had continued to expand in ways that would have been impossible during the years when I defined myself entirely through Sarah's achievements. The retirement community had become a vibrant hub of friendship and activity, full of women who had discovered that life after raising children could be just as fulfilling as the decades spent in service to others. Margaret and I had started a book club that focused specifically on memoirs by women who had reinvented themselves later in life. We read stories of grandmothers who had become entrepreneurs, mothers who had gone back to school in their 60s, women who had traveled the world alone after their children moved away. These books became both inspiration and validation for our own journeys of self-discovery. "The thing I love about these stories," Margaret said during one of our meetings, "is that they remind us that our lives don't end when our children grow up. That was just the first act. We get to write the second act ourselves." My pottery had evolved from a hobby into something approaching a small business. Local galleries featured my work regularly, and I had developed a following among collectors who appreciated the imperfect beauty of hand-thrown ceramics. More importantly, the process of creating something beautiful from raw clay had become a meditation on transformation, how pressure and heat and patience could turn formless earth into objects of lasting beauty. I started teaching pottery classes at the community center, working with women who were discovering artistic expression for the first time in their lives. Many of them were in similar situations to my own, mothers and grandmothers who had spent decades caring for others and were finally learning to care for themselves. "I never thought I was creative," one of my students, a 70-year-old retired nurse named Dorothy, told me as she shaped her first successful bowl. "I spent 50 years taking care of sick people and never had time to think about what I might want to make." These women became more than students. They became a community of mutual support and encouragement. We celebrated each other's artistic successes and personal victories with the enthusiasm of people who understood how hard it was to claim space for yourself after years of self-erasure. One particularly meaningful project began when Grace started asking questions about our family history. Sarah brought her to visit me one weekend, and Grace became fascinated by the old photo albums I kept in my living room. Pictures of her great-grandmother, whom she had never met, and great-great-grandmother, whose stories had been passed down through generations of strong women. "Tell me about the ladies in the pictures," Grace requested, settling into my lap with the expectant attention that children bring to stories about their own origins. I told her about my mother, who had raised 4 children during the Depression, while running a boarding house that kept the family afloat. I explained how her great-great-grandmother had been a teacher at a time when few women worked outside the home, how she had fought for the right to continue teaching even after she married. "Were they happy?" Grace asked with the directness that only children can manage. The question made me pause and really consider the lives of the women who had come before us. "I think they found happiness in different moments," I told her. "But they all had to be very strong because the world didn't make it easy for women to have their own dreams." That conversation inspired me to begin a project that would become one of the most meaningful endeavors of my later years. I started interviewing elderly women in my community, collecting their stories about love and sacrifice, independence and relationships, the choices they had made and the prices they had paid. The stories were remarkable in their diversity and similarity. Women who had given up careers to raise children, who had supported husbands' ambitions while burying their own, who had discovered their true selves only after everyone else had stopped needing them. But also women who had found ways to maintain their identity while loving deeply, who had learned to set boundaries without building walls, who had managed to be generous without being self-destructive. I compiled these stories into a collection that I called The Second Act, planning to self-publish it as a gift for Grace when she was old enough to understand the lessons contained within. But when I shared excerpts with Margaret and my pottery students, they encouraged me to seek wider publication. These stories need to be heard by women who are still in the middle of their first act, Margaret insisted. Women who think that loving their families means disappearing completely. They need to know that there's another way. The process of finding a publisher became an adventure in itself. I had never considered myself a writer, but apparently decades of careful observation and hard-won wisdom had given me something valuable to share. After months of rejections and revisions, a small press that specialized in women's memoirs agreed to publish the collection. The day I held the first copy of The Second Act in my hands, I felt a pride that was entirely different from any satisfaction I had ever derived from Sarah's accomplishments. This was something I had created, a contribution to the world that came from my own thoughts and experiences rather than reflected glory from someone else's achievements. Sarah was among the first to read the book, and her response surprised me with its emotional depth. "Mom, I had no idea you had been thinking about these things so deeply," she said, tears in her eyes as she finished the final story. Reading. This made me realize how little I actually knew about who you were as a person, not just as my mother. She was particularly moved by a story I had included about our own relationship. Not the painful parts, but the healing that had happened when we both learned to treat each other as complete human beings, rather than functions in each other's lives. "I want Grace to read this someday," Sarah said. "I want her to understand that women don't have to choose between loving their families and respecting themselves." The book's modest success led to speaking engagements at women's groups and book clubs throughout the region. I found myself traveling to libraries and community centers, sharing the stage with other women who had discovered their voices later, in life. These events became celebrations of second chances and new beginnings, gatherings where women of all ages could see that reinvention was possible at any stage of life. One particularly memorable evening, I spoke at a library in a small town about an hour from my home. The audience was mixed. Young mothers looking exhausted and overwhelmed, middle-aged women whose children were starting to leave home, and older women who were just beginning to imagine what life might look like when they were no longer needed as caregivers. During the question-and-answer session, a woman about Sarah's age raised her hand. "My mother does everything for my family," she said. "She babysits whenever I ask, helps with household projects, never says no to anything we need. But lately, she seems resentful and I don't understand why. We appreciate everything she does." The question hit close to home, and I could see that many women in the audience were leaning forward, interested in my response. "Appreciation is wonderful," I said carefully, "but it's not the same as consideration. Your mother may need you to ask what works for her schedule before assuming she's available. She may need you to recognize that her time and energy have value, not just to you, but to her own life and interests." "But she never says no," the woman protested. "How am I supposed to know if she doesn't want to help?" "Many women of my generation were taught that saying no was selfish," I explained. "We learned to say yes even when it hurt us, because we believed that was what love looked like. But love that only flows one direction isn't sustainable. Maybe try asking your mother what she needs from you, not just what you need from her." After the event, several women approached me privately to share their own stories of relationships strained by unbalanced expectations and unspoken resentments. I realized that the patterns I had experienced with Sarah were far more common than I had imagined, that many families were trapped in cycles of giving and taking that served no one well. These conversations reinforced my conviction that speaking, about these issues was important work, that sharing my story might help other women find the courage to demand better treatment or offer more consideration. The book began to reach women who saw their own lives reflected in the stories, who realized they weren't alone in feeling invisible or taken for granted. Grace, now old enough to understand some of these concepts, had become my most enthusiastic supporter. Grandma Carol helps ladies learn to be strong, she would tell people when they asked about my book. At 6 years old, she was already absorbing lessons about self-respect and healthy relationships that had taken me 60 years to learn. One afternoon, when Grace was visiting for the weekend, she asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Grandma, why did it take you so long to learn that you were important too?" The innocent directness of the question made me laugh, but it also made me think seriously about how to answer. Sometimes grown-ups forget things that children know. Naturally, I told her. Children know that everyone's feelings matter. But sometimes adults get confused and think that loving someone means your feelings don't matter anymore. "That's silly," Grace said with the confidence of someone who had never been taught to minimize her own needs. "Everyone's feelings matter, even grown-ups." Her certainty on this point filled me with hope for her future. Grace was growing up in a family where boundaries were respected, where love didn't require self-sacrifice, where everyone's needs were considered important. She would never have to unlearn the lessons that had taken me decades to overcome. As I watched Grace play in my garden that afternoon, carefully watering the plants I had taught her to tend, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or achievement. I had broken a cycle of unhealthy relationship, patterns that had been passed down through generations. I had learned to love without losing myself, to give without emptying myself, to be useful without being used. The woman who had once slept in a cold basement rather than risk confrontation was gone, replaced by someone who understood that teaching people how to treat you is one of the greatest gifts you can give, not just to yourself, but to everyone who loves you. In learning to respect myself, I had taught Sarah to respect others. In modeling healthy boundaries, I had shown Grace what love looked like when it flowed both ways. And in finally claiming my own life at 67 years old, I had discovered that the second act could be even better than the first. 10 years had passed since that cold November night when I made the decision that changed everything. Grace was now 15. A remarkable young woman who carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been taught that her needs were less important than anyone else's. Sarah had grown into a mother who understood that raising a strong daughter meant modeling strength rather than sacrifice, and I had become someone I barely recognized from my earlier life. A woman who took up space in the world without apology. The anniversary of what our family had come to call the Great Awakening wasn't something we celebrated formally, but each November I found myself reflecting on how dramatically all our lives had shifted from that single moment of choosing dignity over accommodation. What struck me most profoundly was how that one decision had created ripple effects that continued to expand in ways I never could have imagined. Grace had just started her sophomore year of high school, and watching her navigate the social complexities of teenage life was both fascinating and reassuring. Unlike the anxious, people-pleasing girl I had been at her age, Grace moved through her world with a quiet confidence that came from never having learned that being liked required making herself smaller. "Some of the girls at school think I'm too direct," she told me during one of our monthly grandmother-granddaughter dinners, a tradition we had established when she turned 10. "They think I should be more agreeable, especially with boys. But Mom always says that anyone who needs you to be less than you are isn't worth your time." I smiled, recognizing Sarah's wisdom in those words while marveling at how naturally Grace absorbed lessons that had taken me decades to learn. "What do you think about that advice?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.